At 9 years old, I stood in the doorway of our empty house in Brisbane, Australia, holding a single suitcase containing 3 dresses, 2 Watchtower magazines, and a faded photo of my family before everything fell apart. My father had sold absolutely everything, the house, the car, even my mother's wedding jewelry, because the congregation elders had guaranteed that Armageddon would arrive before the end of 1975. Only 6 weeks remained. He gave all the money to the organization, convinced that material possessions would be worthless in the new world that was about to dawn. My mother cried in the bathroom every night, but she also believed, because to question was the same as losing eternal life. Today, 46 years later, at the age of 55, I still wake up startled in the middle of the night with nightmares of that period. I see my younger brother, only 5, asking why we couldn't eat more than rice and beans while other brothers in the congregation still had full refrigerators. I remember the look on my father's face when December 1975 ended and the sun rose normally on January 1, 1976. There were no trumpets. There were no angels. There was no end. Just the deafening silence of a broken promise, and a family utterly destroyed. What I am about to tell you is not just my story, but the story of thousands of families who lost everything based on a prophecy that never came true. It is about how a religious organization can control every aspect of your life, from what you wear to whom you talk to, and how the price of that control can be measured in ruined lives, shattered relationships, and stolen childhoods. It is about the woman I became after spending half my life inside a religion, and the other half trying to recover from it. This is the truth no one in the congregation wants you to know. This is the story that cost me everything to finally be able to tell. And if you are reading this now, especially if you are still inside or know someone who is, I need you to understand every word, because the pattern keeps repeating, just with different dates. My name is Joyce Patterson. I am 55 years old, and for the first 32 years of my life, I didn't make a single decision that was truly mine. Every choice, every move, every thought I had first passed through the filter of what the Jehovah's Witnesses organization considered acceptable. I didn't choose my education, which stopped after high school because college was viewed as a waste of time when the end was so near. I didn't choose my career, which was limited to part-time jobs that allowed me to dedicate as many hours as possible to the field service. I didn't even choose whom to marry, because dating was only permitted with baptized brothers, and courtship had more rules than an international treaty. But the choice that was never mine, the decision that marked my entire existence, was the one my parents made in 1973 when I was only 7. They decided to completely believe the prophecy that the world would end in 1975. It wasn't a passive belief, the kind you hold deep in your heart while continuing to live normally. It was an absolute, consuming faith that led them to make irreversible decisions that would affect our family for the next 50 years. And I, a child who still believed in fairies and played with dolls, was dragged along in this wave of apocalyptic fervor without having the slightest idea of what was coming. Before continuing with this story, I need to ask something of you who are reading or watching this now. If this narrative is touching your heart in any way, if you recognize elements of your own experience, or the experience of someone you love, please leave a like on this video. This helps more people who need to hear this story find it. Subscribe to the channel because I will continue sharing true accounts from people who, like me, managed to leave and rebuild their lives. And in the comments, tell me which city you are watching from, because I want to know where these stories are reaching. I want to know that I am not alone on this journey of healing and awareness. The story I am about to narrate is not easy to tell, and it probably won't be easy to hear. It will touch on wounds that many prefer to keep covered, it will expose truths that the organization works hard to hide. But it is a story that needs to be told, because as long as there is silence, there will be more families destroyed, more traumatized children, more lives wasted waiting for an end that never comes. So take a deep breath with me, because we are going back together to Brisbane, Australia, in the year 1973, when everything began to fall apart. I remember exactly the day I realized something had changed at home, although at the time I didn't have the words to describe what I was feeling. It was a Sunday morning, and we were getting ready for the meeting at the Kingdom Hall, as we did every week. My mother was ironing my meeting dress, the navy blue one with the white collar that I hated because it made my neck itch, when my father walked into the room with a copy of the March 1973 Watchtower magazine in his hands. His face had an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of excitement and fear that made his eyes shine in a strange way. He didn't say anything initially, he just showed the magazine to my mother, pointing to a specific article, and I saw her hands tremble slightly as she held the iron. At that moment, I was 7 years old and more concerned with the fact that my school friend, a worldly girl named Sophie, had invited me to her birthday party, and I knew I couldn't go. I didn't understand all the rules yet, but I already knew we didn't celebrate birthdays because they were of pagan origin, just like Christmas, Easter, and any other festivity that the other children seemed to enjoy so much. While my parents talked in low voices about 6,000 years of human history and biblical chronology, I was thinking about how I would explain to Sophie that I couldn't eat her cake without sounding completely weird. The other kids at school already looked at me differently because I didn't sing the national anthem and had to leave the room during holiday celebrations. Over the following weeks, the conversations in our house changed completely. Before, my parents talked about normal things during dinner, like bills to pay, some problem at my father's mechanic job, or plans for the small garden my mother kept in the backyard. Now, every meal turned into a discussion about signs of the times, about how world conditions proved that we were living in the last days. My father brought statistics about wars, famines, and earthquakes, always relating everything back to the prophecy. My mother agreed with everything, quoting verses from Matthew 24 that she had memorized. My younger brother, Danny, who was only 3, didn't pay attention and played with his food, but I sat quietly, trying to understand why my parents seemed so happy talking about the end of the world. The meetings at the Kingdom Hall also changed dramatically. Before, the discourses were about various biblical themes, about how to be a good Christian, about morals and behavior. Now, it seemed that every talk, every part of the Watchtower study, every comment during the meetings revolved around 1975. The elders spoke with an absolute certainty that was both fascinating and terrifying. Brother Collins, a stout elder with a mustache, who always smelled of mothballs, gave an entire talk calculating exactly how many months remained until the fall of 1975, when the 6,000 years of man's creation would be complete. He used a chalkboard to show the chronology, tracing lines from the year of Adam's creation to the present, and every mark he made seemed to seal our fate a little more. What scared me the most were not the words themselves, but the reaction of the people around us. Adults I had known my whole life, people who seemed sensible and normal, began to act in increasingly strange ways. Sister Jenkins, an elderly lady who always gave me peppermint candies after the meetings, sold her house and went to live with her daughter so she could devote more time to the field service. Brother Wakefield stopped taking his son to the dentist because, according to him, it wasn't worth spending money on teeth that would soon not exist anymore in this system of things. My own mother began to refuse invitations for family lunches with her worldly relatives, saying that we needed to focus on helping people who could still be saved before it was too late. The atmosphere in the congregation went from a quiet expectation to an almost palpable frenzy, as if we were all on a boat knowing there was an iceberg ahead, but instead of trying to avoid it, we were accelerating toward it. I was just a child trying to understand a world that grew more confusing every day. At school, I learned about plans for the future, about different professions, about how life would continue. At home and at the Kingdom Hall, I heard that none of that mattered because the future, as we knew it, wouldn't exist. How was a 7-year-old supposed to process that contradiction? How was I supposed to feel knowing that all my classmates, including Sophie with her birthday party, would soon be destroyed because their families didn't know the truth? These questions began to form a knot in my stomach that has never truly undone itself, even decades later. I spent nights awake, looking out my bedroom window, wondering if that would be the night Jehovah finally brought Armageddon, wondering if I was good enough to survive, wondering if my non-witness grandparents really deserved to die as the elders said would happen. It was in January 1974 that my father made the decision that would change our lives forever. I was 8 years old and in the 3rd grade of primary school, when he came home, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and announced that he had put our house up for sale. My mother dropped the plate she was washing, and the sound of the crockery breaking on the floor seemed to echo the crash that this news caused in my childish mind. That house in Nunda, a suburb of Brisbane, was everything I knew. It was where I had taken my first steps, where Danny had been born, where every corner held a memory. But my father explained, with that firm voice he used when quoting the organization's publications, that owning property in this system of things was a demonstration of lack of faith. If we truly believed that 1975 would bring the end, why were we clinging to material things? The following months were a blur of increasingly drastic changes. The house sold quickly to a young family who were excited about the location close to good schools, an irony that did not go unnoticed even by my childish mind. They talked about renovation plans, about where they would put the swing set for their children in the backyard, about which room would be the father's office. Plans. Future. Concepts that were being systematically removed from my reality. After the house sold, my father got rid of almost all our furniture, donating some to needy brothers in the congregation, and simply throwing others away. I remember watching my bed, where I had slept my whole life, being carried to the garbage collection truck, because my father said it wasn't worth the effort of trying to sell it. We moved to a tiny rented apartment in Fortitude Valley, a much less desirable area of Brisbane. The apartment had only 2 bedrooms, so Danny and I shared a small room with bunk beds that my parents bought used, while they slept in the other. There was no backyard, just a small balcony where my mother tried, unsuccessfully, to keep some of the plants she had loved so much in the previous house. But the apartment was cheap, and that was all that mattered, because now all the money my father earned as a mechanic went to 2 things: the absolute minimum necessary for our survival and substantial donations to the organization. He had calculated exactly how much we needed for rent, basic food, and essential bills, and everything beyond that was contributed to the worldwide work, as the elders constantly encouraged. But selling the house was only the beginning. My father also sold our car, a 1970 blue Ford Falcon, that he had loved and meticulously cared for. The justification was that we could use public transport and hitch rides with other brothers to the meetings and the field service. In practice, this meant that we were always dependent on the kindness of others, always waiting, always adjusting our lives to other people's schedules. My mother had to carry heavy bags of groceries on the bus, often with Danny complaining on her lap, and me trying to help despite not having enough strength. I watched my mother cry silently in the back seat of Sister Peterson's car after a meeting, when she thought no one was looking, the tears running silently, as she looked out the window at the familiar streets passing by. The most devastating aspect of these changes was seeing my father transform into someone I barely recognized. Before, he had been a practical, hard-working man who liked to fix things around the house on Sunday afternoons and who took me to the park to fly a kite on weekends. Now, he was consumed by a singular obsession. He stopped accepting overtime at work, despite us desperately needing the extra money, because it would interfere with the field service. He started going from door to door almost every day, leaving early in the morning and returning exhausted at night, with only a few magazines placed to show for his efforts. He meticulously recorded his hours in a small notebook he kept in his shirt pocket, and I saw him counting and recounting the numbers, as if the amount of hours he dedicated could somehow guarantee our salvation. My education also became a victim of this apocalyptic preparation. Until then, I had been a reasonably good student. I liked to read and I had a teacher, Miss Andrews, who said I had the potential to do great things. But now, my parents began to question the value of education. Why study history if the current system would soon be destroyed? Why learn advanced math if there would be no economy or commerce in the new world? When Miss Andrews suggested that I could be placed in an advanced class, my parents politely but firmly refused. They said they preferred me to focus on spiritual truths rather than secular knowledge. I saw the confusion on Miss Andrews' face, and I also saw the moment she gave up trying to understand, simply agreeing and never bringing the subject up again. What marked me the most from this period were not the big changes, but the small losses that accumulated like raindrops until they formed a flood. I lost my 9th birthday because celebrations were forbidden. I lost the chance to learn to play the piano because the lessons cost money that should go to the organization. I lost friendships at school because my parents no longer let me go to any social event, not even class lunches at school. I lost the sense of security that a child should have, because every day seemed to bring us closer to a catastrophic event that I was supposed to be eager to witness, but which actually terrified me. And while all this was happening, the elders at the Kingdom Hall praised my parents as shining examples of faith, as pioneers in the true sense of the word, as people who truly believed and lived according to their beliefs. No one asked me or Danny how we were coping with all this. Children had no voice in the congregation, except to give memorized answers during the meetings. The year 1975 arrived with a mixture of frantic expectation and underlying terror that permeated every aspect of our lives. I was 9 years old and had spent the last 2 years constantly hearing about how this would be the most important year in human history. The meetings at the Kingdom Hall were now crowded, with people arriving earlier to guarantee a good seat, and the discourses reached a level of intensity that seemed to vibrate in the air. Brother Collins gave a talk in February calculating exactly how many days, how many hours remained until the fall, when Armageddon was expected to begin. He spoke with absolute certainty, citing the organization's publications, referencing complex chronological calculations that most people in the audience did not fully understand, but accepted without question, because it came from a source they had been trained to blindly trust. At home, the situation had deteriorated even further. My mother had completely stopped buying anything that wasn't absolutely essential. Our meals consisted of rice, beans, occasionally some cheap meat, and vegetables she bought at the end of the day at the market when they were almost spoiling and sold at reduced prices. Danny, who was now 5, was always hungry and complained constantly, but my mother just said he needed to learn to be grateful for what he had, because soon we would have abundance in the new world. I learned not to complain, not because I wasn't hungry, but because I saw the weight that every complaint added to my mother's already bowed shoulders. She had lost a drastic amount of weight, her meeting dresses now hanging loose on her body, and there was a weariness in her eyes that no amount of sleep seemed to cure. My father had become completely obsessed. He was now a regular pioneer, dedicating 70 hours a month to the field service, which meant he had cut his hours at work to the absolute minimum. We were surviving on a fraction of what he used to earn, and the bills piled up in an ever-growing stack on the kitchen table. I saw my mother looking at those bills with an expression of silent despair, but she never said anything to my father, who was convinced that Jehovah would provide. Jehovah's provision, we discovered, usually came in the form of other brothers in the congregation who occasionally brought us bags of groceries or offered to pay a particularly urgent bill. These helps were accepted with gratitude, but they also came with an invisible cost, the cost of our dignity, of our independence, of the sense that my father was capable of providing for his family. As the months progressed, I began to notice increasing tensions in the congregation that were previously not visible. Not everyone was making decisions as drastic as my parents. There were brothers who still had their houses, their cars, their savings intact. They spoke about 1975 with the same conviction at the meetings, but their actions did not match their words. This created an unstated division, A silent hierarchy where families like ours, who had sacrificed everything, were seen as more spiritual, more devoted, more worthy of survival. The elders subtly reinforced this, using families like ours as examples in discourses, praising our sacrifice while implicitly criticizing those who were unwilling to do the same. I felt the weight of those looks when we arrived at meetings in our increasingly worn clothes, Danny in shoes that were getting too small, but couldn't be replaced. In September 1975, with only weeks remaining until the eagerly awaited fall, the atmosphere in the congregation reached a point of almost palpable hysteria. There was a special meeting where a representative of the governing body visited our congregation, and the Kingdom Hall was so full that people stood in the back and crowded at the entrance. His talk lasted almost 2 hours, and every word was a confirmation of what we were waiting for. He spoke about how the signs were undeniable, how the prophecies were being fulfilled before our eyes, how we needed to remain vigilant because the end would come like a thief in the night. When he finished, there was applause, something that rarely happened at the Kingdom Hall, and I saw tears in the eyes of many adults, including my mother. But while the adults around me seemed energized by these messages, I felt increasingly scared. I was 9 years old and I didn't want the world to end. I liked the world, despite all the limitations my religion imposed. I liked going to school, even if I couldn't participate in all the activities. I liked the books I read in the school library, stories of adventures and distant places that I dreamed of visiting one day. I liked watching people on the street when we rode the bus, imagining their lives, their stories. And all these people would be destroyed. Really? My childish mind couldn't reconcile the concept of a loving God with the mass destruction of billions of people, whose only crime was not knowing the truth, or not accepting it. But I couldn't express these doubts to anyone, because doubt was seen as a lack of faith, and a lack of faith could cost you your eternal life. October came and went. November arrived, and the tension was almost unbearable. Every meeting seemed to be about staying faithful, about not letting disappointment creep in, about trusting Jehovah's timing. But it was becoming clear that something was wrong. The fall was almost over, and nothing had happened. There were no signs in the heavens. There were no angels' trumpets. The sun continued to rise and set normally, people continued their mundane lives unaware that they should have been destroyed. In December, when it became impossible to deny that 1975 was ending without the promised Armageddon, the atmosphere in the congregation changed dramatically. The discourses now were about patience, about how possibly the calculations did not account for a certain period of time, about how the important thing was to remain faithful regardless of specific dates. But I saw in the faces of the people, especially in faces like my parents, that something fundamental had broken, a trust that would never be fully restored. January 1976 dawned like any other day, except that it carried the crushing weight of a failed prophecy and lives destroyed in the expectation of something that never happened. My father spent New Year's Day sitting on the balcony of our tiny apartment, staring into nothing, without saying a word. My mother tried to maintain some semblance of normality, preparing breakfast and tidying the house, but her movements were mechanical, empty, as if she were a robot executing basic programming without actually being present. Danny was too confused to understand what was happening, but even at 5 he felt the change in the atmosphere and stayed quiet, playing silently with the few toys he still had. And I, at 9, felt a confused mixture of relief, because the world hadn't ended, and terror about what this meant for our family. The meetings at the Kingdom Hall in the first months of 1976 were surreal. Attendance had dropped dramatically, with many families simply not showing up anymore. Those who continued to come had defeated expressions, eyes that avoided direct contact with others, as if everyone shared a collective shame of having been so completely deceived. The elders tried to control the damage with carefully crafted discourses about how there was never truly an official prophecy of a specific date, how it was some overly enthusiastic brothers who jumped to conclusions, how the organization had always been cautious in setting dates. But these words sounded hollow when all of us had been there, had read the same magazines, heard the same talks that clearly indicated 1975 would bring significant changes. Our financial situation was desperate. My father had sold everything, had donated all the money from the house sale, had reduced his working hours to the point where we could barely afford the rent for the miserable apartment. Now, with the inescapable reality that life would continue, he had to face the consequences of his decisions. He tried to go back to full-time work, but he had lost some of his best clients during the period he was only working part-time. Other mechanics had filled the void he left. His reputation had suffered because he had openly spoken about his beliefs at work, trying to witness to colleagues and clients, and now those same colleagues looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt that was painful to witness. My mother started working for the first time in her life, taking a part-time job as a cleaner in offices at night. She left after we came back from school and didn't return until late, arriving exhausted and with red, rough hands from the cleaning chemicals. A woman who had been a proud homemaker, who kept our previous house immaculately clean and prepared elaborate homemade meals, was now cleaning other people's offices for minimum wage while our own apartment accumulated dirt, because she was too tired to take care of it. The changes in her were the hardest to watch. She had been a woman full of life, who sang while cooking, who told me stories before bed, who laughed easily. Now, she was faded, like a photograph left too long in the sun, all the colors washed out until only a pale outline of what she had been remained. The following years were a slow downward spiral of poverty and disillusionment. Many families left the organization completely after 1975, unable to reconcile what had been promised to them with the reality they faced. Some did it openly, writing letters of disassociation, expressing their anger and disappointment. Others simply disappeared, stopping going to meetings until they were eventually marked as inactive. Our family stayed, but not out of renewed faith or restored conviction. We stayed because we had nowhere else to go, because all our social network was in the congregation, because the idea of starting completely from scratch without friends, without a support system, without the only world we knew, was more terrifying than continuing in an organization that had profoundly disappointed us. The organization never took responsibility for what happened. There was never an official apology, never an acknowledgement of the real suffering that their publications had caused. Instead, there was a silent revision of history, where old articles that spoke confidently about 1975 were discreetly forgotten, where past publications were simply no longer mentioned, where the narrative was slowly rewritten to suggest that any disappointment was the fault of the members themselves for having unrealistic expectations. This institutional denial, this refusal to acknowledge the pain that had been caused, was in some ways more damaging than the failed prophecy itself. Because it meant there could be no true healing, no closure, just an open wound that was constantly irritated by the continued presence in the organization that had caused it. I grew up in this environment of disillusionment and denial, a child who had lost her childhood to a false prophecy, who had witnessed the complete destruction of her family's stability and security, who had learned from a very young age that authorities you trusted could be profoundly and irrevocably wrong. The lessons I learned during that period shaped who I became, both positively and negatively. I learned to question authority, not to accept proclamations without evidence, to value material security in ways that people who never experienced real poverty may never fully understand. But I also developed chronic anxiety, an inability to plan for the future, because some part of me still expects everything to collapse at any moment, complicated relationships with trust and authority that affect every aspect of my life even today. The price of 1975 was not only paid that year, but continues to be collected decades later, in therapy, in broken relationships, in lost dreams that could never be recovered. Today, at 55, I finally left the Jehovah's Witnesses organization at 32, more than a decade after the failed prophecy of 1975. It took all that time for me to find the courage to leave, for me to build a life outside the only structures I knew, for me to develop the strength to face the loss of every person I had known and loved within the congregation, who were obligated to treat me as if I were dead due to the disfellowshipping policy. My parents never left the organization, despite everything they lost, despite all the broken promises. They are old now, still going to meetings, still waiting for an Armageddon that should have arrived decades ago. I haven't spoken to them for 23 years due to my decision to leave, and this is one of the many tragedies this organization has left in its wake. My brother Danny developed serious substance abuse problems in his teens, using drugs as a way to escape a traumatic childhood that he can barely process even now at 48. He also left the organization, but in a way that marked him as disassociated, cutting him off not only from our parents, but from any sense of community or belonging. The poverty we faced after 1975 affected his education, his opportunities, his ability to dream of a better future. He works minimum wage jobs, has never been able to maintain a stable relationship, carries a rage towards the religion of our childhood that sometimes frightens me in its intensity. He and I are survivors, but our scars are deep and permanent. I share this story not to receive pity, but to serve as a warning. The Jehovah's Witnesses organization continues to operate with the same patterns that led to the 1975 disaster, only with more care to avoid specific dates. They still encourage members to put the organization before family, before education, before any planning for the future. They still mark those who leave as apostates who must be shunned, destroying families in the process. They still operate with a level of control over every aspect of members' lives that is incompatible with true religious or spiritual freedom. And they still refuse to take responsibility for the harm they cause, preferring to rewrite history and blame individual members for any unmet expectations. If you are reading this and are still inside the organization, especially if you have doubts you are afraid to express, know that those doubts are valid. Questioning is not a lack of faith, it is an exercise of healthy critical thinking. If you are considering making drastic sacrifices based on promises of imminent changes, please learn from my story. Protect yourself, protect your family, do not hand over your entire life to an organization that will not take responsibility when their predictions inevitably fail. And if you are someone who has left, who carries the scars of years inside control systems like this, know that you are not alone, that your pain is real and valid, that it is possible to build a new life even after losing everything you knew. The journey is difficult, but on the other side there is freedom, truth, and the possibility of finally living according to your own choices instead of the choices of others. This is Joyce and Patterson, sharing my story so that perhaps it can help prevent other stories like mine from repeating.